Perhaps the most interesting of those for me was a biologist by the name of Merlin Sheldrake, who'd been 3 years at Cambridge University and in the Panama jungle studying the relationship between this fungus and a plant, the plant being quite unique, a Voyria, in that it doesn't photosynthesize, it has no chlorophyll, and it seemingly gets all of its energy directly from the fungus. So it's always assumed to be parasitic. Merlin wasn't entirely sure about this. He spent 3 years studying it, came to our lab, we gave him LSD, and his experience was that he turned into the fungus and had this kind of new perspective, which gave him some new thoughts and ideas about what the nature of this relationship might actually be. But above and beyond that, it changed his perspective about how to do biology and in fact, how we might do better science as well. In that, for the first time, he didn't see his problem as a human, Merlin Sheldrake, but as, or from the perspective of the fungus. And, you know, it's only then, after 3 years, he had these kind of insights. So there's like an invitation and a room here to bring in some kind of indigenous kinds of epistemologies into the academy, because it turns out this is the kind of epistemology we see throughout the Americas, particularly where the use of psychedelics are used in ritual practices. In that, if you want to obtain information from something, you want to know something about something, the best way to do that is to become that thing. You know, so knowing by becoming, what the anthropologist Eduardo Vivero de Castro calls perspectivism. And it's something that we see kind of broadly used, particularly use of ayahuasca and learning from doctor trees and understanding the medicinal properties of plants and so on and so forth. And so it kind of invites in this curious intersection between different ways of obtaining knowledge, which may or may not include some kind of direct communication or becoming with other species, or some kind of transcendence of time or clairvoyance, but nevertheless can lead to better creative problem-solving insights around very difficult scientific problems. And I think this could especially apply to ecological situations and our ecological crises, in that, you know, thinking like in this traditional objective, materialist, reductive, scientific way has got us into all kinds of problems. You know, it's seen everything as kind of dead and inert and there to be exploited. You know, and the objective scientific agenda is to distance yourself as far as possible from the thing you're trying to study. You take it out of its natural environment, you atomize it, you desiccate it, you chop it up, you put it under a microscope, and we get as far away from it as we can, and we call that objective science, and we attempt to understand it in this kind of dead and inert way. Whereas the kind of more indigenous epistemologies are about, you know, becoming that thing, communicating with it, recognizing yourself in it and it in yourself. And it's a more engaged and connected kind of epistemology. And I think, you know, the way we are going currently, like our science has brought us to the brink of ecological disaster, this kind of traditional objective approach. And as Einstein said, you know, the same thinking that got you into the problem is not the same kind of thinking you need to use to get out of that problem. So I'm thinking, you know, I think there's an opportunity here to kind of sneak in kind of under the radar some of these kind of indigenous shamanic perspectives, quite literally, about how we can come to understand and interact with the natural world that we are. We are the natural world. And that's one of the other things we see in this research that I've been doing coming through, is that psychedelics in particular have this massive capacity for changing people's ecological compass, right? So we see these kind of huge changes in how people relate to the natural world following their psychedelic experiences. Like we see these big increases in what we call nature connectedness or nature relatedness. You know, one of the surveys I did about a decade ago, we asked, you know, 150 psychedelic users, has taking psychedelics changed in any way how you relate to the natural world? And 100% of them, which is something you never see in psychological research, every one of them, 100% of the psychedelic users said taking psychedelics had made them feel more connected to nature. So we see these big kind of attitudinal shifts or kind of worldview shifts through the use of psychedelics and altered states. They have a tendency to urge people more in a kind of an indigenous kind of worldview in many ways, and we see that both within these kind of experiences of perspectivism, which turn out to be very common. A quarter of ayahuasca users, Westerners, who'd taken ayahuasca, reported having the experience of being transformed into another species, right? This is something as everyday and common to indigenous people, but something completely alien to Westerners. And it's not something you see necessarily advertised on your ayahuasca retreat brochures. You know, people are going for spiritual enlightenment or dealing with their mental health issues or whatever. You know, it doesn't say you, chances are you might get the experience of being transformed into another species. And we see this also occurring with good old common or garden, European, lab-created psychedelics like LSD. You know, 10% of LSD users have also had this experience. So there's something inherent about these journeys into altered states, which can lead people into these kind of more indigenous ways of epistemology, like perspectivism, but also we see increases in kind of animistic worldviews as well. There is a really kind of increase in how psychedelics, you know, once people take psychedelics, they're more likely to apply sentience to more non-self things, including, you know, other humans, other primates, other animals, other kind of biological life forms, and even inanimate objects, man-made or otherwise. So people increase their kind of animistic perspectives after these transformative psychedelic experiences, and also their metaphysical worldviews. And there seems to be an interesting trend in that the direction of change of metaphysical beliefs is always unidirectional, and that direction is away from materialist reductionism, okay, away from the idea that everything is just inert and dead matter, and that, you know, consciousness is some kind of calamitous side effect of just having a brain, and in the direction of pretty much any other kind of metaphysics, such as dualism, the idea that mind and body are separate entities, or even you know, idealism, the kind of ideas that Bernardo Kastrup puts forward, or favored seems to be an increase in belief in panpsychism, that everything is inherently conscious. So we see these big metaphysical shifts and also big spiritual shifts as well following psychedelic experiences. For instance, in one study which surveyed several thousand people who had taken DMT and at high doses had had an encounter with an entity, when they looked at their prior and post spiritual beliefs, those people had said that they were atheist beforehand, less than half of them remained atheist after their DMT entity encounters. So we're seeing these kind of profound shifts, always in the direction of this more kind of indigenous worldviews. And that's probably a really good thing in our current ecological situation and kind of psychological, cultural, political situation we are as a species, in that, you know, indigenous perspectives generally incorporate this kind of idea of reciprocity, you know, that there is a kind of relationship. Everything is relational between yourself and other beings in the natural world, because we are all nature, and that you never take without first asking, that you never take more than you need, and you also always give something in return. And if we followed those principles, we wouldn't have rapacious extractivism and, you know, the kind of the overuse of kind of resources and habitat destruction and ecological collapse and all the rest of it. So I think it's probably a good thing that we're seeing these kind of altered states like driving these kind of huge kind of psychological, metaphysical, spiritual, ontological, epistemological shifts in people's relationship with themselves and the universe and the planet and other species. And I think it needs to go further. You know, when we see these changes in people's connection to nature, it's great. The people's shifts that are having with psychedelics is seemingly far bigger than like even like a nature connectedness intervention programs where people go and spend a couple of weeks in the wilderness. Doses of psilocybin are seemingly more reliable in making people feel connected after those kind of interventions. And yet, in the Western world, if you were to take to kind of like make a Venn diagram of like nature and self, like and ask people, well, how much do they overlap? Yeah. A lot of people in the developed world will kind of like just have this kind of little bit of overlap. Um, those people are more ecologically orientated, obviously have an even bigger overlap, and also once they've taken psychedelics. But you ask kind of indigenous people, particularly, and like, well, first of all, they say it's a ridiculous question, but effectively they have a one-to-one relationship of self and nature. And in fact, like the work of Nabi again, and in other cultures too, like he worked with the Ashaninka, and he was trying to understand from them what is their name for nature. They had a word for their kind of culture, their kind of cultural things and elements, but there was no word for nature, and that was because there was no difference between culture and nature. And like one is the absence of the other by our definition. In the Western concept, what is cultural is that which is not natural, is that which is produced by humans, right? And what is natural is not cultural. And yet, in these indigenous perspectives, they're inseparable. You're right. There is no difference between nature and culture. So that's just some of the fun stuff I've been doing, and I think a lot of this work and the research in transpersonal psychology and parapsychology and the kind of growing, really booming interest in psychedelics is inevitably driving some really interesting shifts, and it's kind of popped the cork on the genie's bottle within the academy, and it's kind of forcing even very mainstream highly respectable academic institutions to begin to ask questions of these kind of like ontologically challenging questions about the nature of consciousness and the nature of reality, and whether or not entities may actually be real, or whether or not people genuinely have out of body when they leave their body, when they have out of body experiences, and around near death experiences and mystical experiences and so on. And so yeah, I'm feeling quite hopeful that we're kind of moving in a more positive direction, but time is short, and I think psychedelics have an important role in being that kind of more turbocharged catalyst in this transformation.